Well, great. Welcome everyone to this conversation with Dr. Nathan Babcock. Let me introduce our speaker today so that we'll get an idea of who he is. He's a very accomplished scientist. So our guest today is Dr. Nathan Babcock, a quantum physicist with over 2 decades of research spanning quantum physics, spin chemistry, and molecular biology. He trained at the Perimeter Institute and the Institute for Quantum Computing in Waterloo, earned his PhD in physics at the University of Calgary, and then crossed fully into biology, first as a structural biology postdoc, then studying radical pair models of avian magnetoreception, and later investigating quantum superradiance in microtubules at Howard University's Quantum Biology Laboratory. He has co-authored more than a dozen peer-reviewed papers and recently wrote the field's first foundational monograph, Physical Principles of Quantum Biology. And building on this monograph, he is writing what may become the first textbook in this field. So it's an honor to talk to you, Nathan. Thank you for sharing your time with us. Anything to add to this introduction?
I know the pleasure is all mine. Thank you so much.
Great. Yeah, I'll be asking the questions, but Kira is also here with us, and she'll also interject. She said, ask some questions when it's relevant, so that you know what to expect here. And I'm just going to start with the first question. So I think your career trajectory is interesting. It's a unique way of approaching science, since you first were trained as a physicist at the Perimeter Institute, and then you actually crossed the path towards structural biology, spin chemistry, microtubule physics, and that's kind of rare as a trajectory. Most researchers kind of stay in one lane in their domain, and they specialize more and more in that domain. But you seem to have crossed these two disciplines, physics and biology. So how did you end up bridging the two, and what does that give you as a vantage point over maybe somebody who is just a single discipline scientist?
Well, I did my undergrad at the University of Waterloo. Worked at the Institute for Quantum Computing, as you mentioned, and Perimeter Institute there. I went on for the my graduate studies at the Institute for Quantum Information Science in Calgary, Alberta. So I thought a lot about quantum computing, qubits, and can we even build a quantum computer, or will decoherence take over? And I had already actually done a bit of work in soft materials experimental physics, and I had taken a biophysics course, and I really got thinking, wow, molecular biology uh, makes all these chemicals, carries out all these metabolic transformations, creates these complex molecules we can't even simulate yet necessarily on a quantum computer. And that made me more and more fascinated in biology. And to me, the most interesting quantum effects that I was seeing were in biology. That's really what drove my interest in the work. But I'm not sure, when you talk about the multidisciplinary nature of it, if you go to the Biophysical Society meeting, you'll meet thousands of biophysicists. And in the 21st century, a lot of research becomes more and more interdisciplinary. And in fact, in some sense, that's becoming the norm. But what I would say about quantum biology as a multidisciplinary field is we need quantum physicists, quantum chemists, structural biologists, spectroscopists. The list goes on and on of also very narrow specialties that have to work together in this multidisciplinary field. I've just been fortunate enough to come about it, from my passion, which is quantum physics.
Okay. Well, that's really interesting, especially since you were talking about this quantum computing and the question, will decoherence take over before we even make the calculation? And I think that that's a very interesting question because it comes up in quantum biology, obviously, as one of the major, let's say, objections to the field or challenges in the field, where basically the decoherence problem is also raised, and maybe the coherence might destroy quantum effects before they actually are functional in biology. What's your take on this problem, since you have already confronted it so early in your career?
This is exactly it. So exactly the same criticism has been leveraged against quantum computing, and Although there's now an enormous investment in quantum computing, different architectures for quantum computers, there are still some holdouts in computer science and mathematics, people who say we'll never build a quantum computer. Decoherence will always take over. But regardless if that's the case, we know we have biological organisms. We know that you can,
Maybe before we go there, for the audience,
yeah.
what is decoherence and why is that a problem?
Ah, right. So there's this, ultimately, it really is a postulate of quantum mechanics that superpositions of quantum states can occur. So
Mhm,
a quantum bit can be not just in the state 0 or 1, like a classical bit, but you can prepare it in a superposition of those
mhm,
two states, like two things being superposed on an image.
mhm,
You can even prepare spatial superpositions where a particle is in a superposition of one place and another place at the same time. And now we're getting into the concept called non-locality, that quantum mechanics is non-local because things can be in more than one place at one time. And so we don't really see that kind of thing on the classical scale, or even in cases where we see the implications of it, we don't recognize it in organic molecules, for example. Any aromatic oils that you might have in an aromatherapy course or an aromatherapy session, all rely on quantum superpositions to create these aromatic molecules, but not usually the way we think of from the perspective of quantum mechanics, where we're imagining these non-local states, spooky action at a distance. Einstein called it over great distances. And so, really the interesting thing is that long range quantum superpositions we don't generally see in nature, over miles or something like that, unless you have like a quantum repeater system that, colleagues of mine are trying to build a quantum internet, right? But on very small scale, those kind of non-local superpositions just in an individual molecule, in fact, become the norm in benzene, for example. And so I hope this has given you some sense of what a superposition is and why we don't see these on the macro scale as a general rule, but on a micro scale, the world of atoms and molecules, in fact, these kind of things are everywhere.
yeah. And then decoherence is basically, it means that we don't see it, right? When we have larger systems, that's when we don't, like, because of decoherence, we don't see the quantum effect, correct? Because the the times for things to be coherent are very, very short usually. And like you said, they involve shorter distances and smaller systems. Is that correct?
That's right. The times on which these superpositions can exist, the time scales and the length scales are generally very short. The time scales of atoms and molecules, which are, femtoseconds and nanometers, or even angstroms, for example. So, again, that was one of the reasons why quantum effects in biology drew me to it, because we're already working on the right length scales to see quantum
Mhm,
superpositions,
mhm,
which is much more challenging on a computer, which is, even for those tiny little bits in your computer, much closer to the macroscopic scale.
mhm. And you also already revealed why you're not so skeptical because according to you, these superpositions become the norm at the tiny scale. So you believe that actually biology is a system where you can see a lot of quantum effects, apparently.
Quantum effects are inherent to every chemical reaction. And in biology, we see a degree of control in metabolism over chemistry that we still cannot accomplish in the laboratory, cannot accomplish on the industrial scale. One of the great challenges in quantum biology today is the chemical process of nitrogen fixing. The air
Mhm,
we breathe is mostly nitrogen gas. Uh, but to take that nitrogen out of the air and turn it into ammonia, now to make fertilizer or other chemical products, actually in industry requires an extremely expensive, high temperature, high pressure process. But bacteria in the soil do it at soil temperatures with no high pressure, no high temperatures. And they do this because of enzyme reactions that are only still partially understood. If we understood them well enough, we could save, countless billions, trillions of dollars in a third green revolution, producing fertilizer for soil at a fraction of the price if we make it today.
yeah. So you're already kind of showing that basically quantum biology might hold the key to understanding a lot of things on on this very small scale of the molecules that we do not understand yet, especially in terms of engineering, if I hear here. So I think one thing that the field is sort of missing is like you wrote in the monograph is like it's missing a coherent foundational piece of text or even a coherence as a field in some sense. So there still isn't this agreed upon textbook, and you took it up on yourself to kind of write this monograph and conceive of the whole field as one thing and writing down its foundations. So why did you take that on? And where are you going with this?
Yeah, well, I'm very humbled by your question. What can I say? When I did my PhD, the goal of a PhD student by the time they make their defense is to know the scope of their field. We should know what we know and what we don't know. Well, this is challenging for me as a PhD student because no one really knew for sure what the scope of quantum biology should be. So I thought about that a lot, during my PhD and since that time. But one thing that was always, and I think even now becomes more and more apparent to me, is that where others seemed skeptical about whether there were evidence for quantum or non-trivial quantum effects in biology, to me, I saw an overwhelming body of evidence for quantum effects. And I pursued studies of these things, as you mentioned, in spin chemistry and studying super radiance effects in microtubules through my postdocs. And eventually, I mean, one day at my wife's urging, she said, Nathan, you got to write a book about this. You've got to put this down, because I've been pursuing the scope of quantum biology since my PhD. I felt I had missed something in not knowing that. And once the monograph began to take shape, it became clear to Brandy, mostly my wife and my co-author in the end, was that it should be a colloquial introduction to quantum mechanics. It should limit the mathematics. In fact, there's no math to speak of in the book at all. And the goal was for other PhD students, grad students that I talked to that faced the same kind of challenges that I did and saying, what is quantum biology really all about? That they would have a book to go to that would kind of lay out at least a sketch of the map of, what is interesting, what is there, where are there dragons? Like if you think of the maps of the old days. And
Yeah.
if you look at the beginning of the book, you'll see a huge list of acknowledgments. Of course, I didn't do it myself. Brandy was an enormous contribution to it from beginning to end. And we put it up on the physics archive for a year, sharing it with everyone who would look at in open review. So I'm very grateful to everyone who has helped and contributed and supported me through this. I certainly didn't do it alone.
Nice. Yeah, well, you guys are really helping us here at the DAO because we also want to map the whole field and kind of see since it's a decentralized organization funding quantum biology, we want to
Mhm.
also kind of use the landscape to know what are maybe where are the treasures on the map, That's sort of that's the
This
view
is
that
it,
I'm
to give
taking.
some
And
lay of the land. That's exactly right.
exactly. Like we want to get the treasures, and maybe we have to fight some dragons because sometimes they get in front of the treasures. That's what I hear in the history.
Yeah, they
That's what
love
they say.
guarding treasures. I'm not sure why.
I don't know. That's what they say.
Right.
Anyway, since you have been doing that and like painting the map, what is maybe the most common misconception that you see people have about the field of quantum biology?
To me, the biggest misconception and potentially the most damaging is that quantum biology isn't quantum mechanics. It's not really quantum mechanics. It's not, or if it's quantum mechanics, it's only trivial quantum mechanics, whatever that means. Where in fact, in my experience, that very advanced knowledge of quantum mechanics is required to understand these effects and even to tease out, what level of approximation is necessary in order to see what's going on here. Um, if I could add one more, another misconception is this idea that quantum biology is a new field. Well, it certainly experienced a renaissance since,
Mhm,
the early mid 2000s, say. But in fact, the history of quantum biology and the study of quantum effects in biology goes back to the early days of quantum mechanics itself.
mhm.
And there are, a Nobel Prize in light therapy from 1903, for example, And at that time, the light therapists didn't know why different colors of light, different frequencies of light had effects. And they invited Niels Bohr, one of the founders of quantum mechanics, to give the opening address at the International Congress on Therapy in the 1930s. So, these questions have been around for as long as quantum mechanics has been around.
Okay. So if like addressing these misconceptions is one end, but there's this also very challenging question now that you might be up to answer, which is like in a one word or in a sentence, what is quantum biology now that we have tried to unify it?
Certainly. So quantum biology is the study of quantum mechanics in living things.
Okay. That's a very simple and clear definition. I like that. That's a workable way to satisfies my satisfies the question very well.
And
Uh,
if I could add, just as biology, innately, it studies the relationships between anatomy and physiology, structure and function, right?
mhm,
In the same way, quantum biology studies the relationship between quantum mechanical structure, for example, the electronic structure of a molecule, and function in living things. And what we discover when we look at that in many cases, the electronic structure is very important to understanding the different aspects of living things.
Okay. So this is maybe a little bit more on as a follow-up to the same question. It's like, so the term is still pretty wide. So we say we are studying the quantum biological structure and then the functions in biology, but that could be sort of anything in many different areas. So that's a big term in some sense. So that
Hmm.
could spark all kinds of wild associations, and I think it has also in the even watching some of the stuff that you can maybe see on YouTube, it goes very far out. So
Sure.
maybe for someone hearing this term quantum biology for the first time, what is actually quantum biology? Like, what are you guys doing? What are you investigating? And what is not quantum biology?
Sure. So mainly we study quantum effects due to the shape of the wave function or the structure, the movement of electrons, protons, atoms, molecules, same as any other area of quantum mechanics. I mean, we don't go as far as particle physics. We're not using big particle colliders, but we do study, of course, organic molecules and spin effects in spin chemistry. And I think I've suggested this already. The core concepts, not focusing on some of those fringe ideas that capture the imagination. The core concepts are much more terrestrial. They're just really, it's the study of the way living systems internally control quantum effects to
Mhm,
accomplish metabolic and chemical transformations in the cell. And
mhm,
every chemical transformation involves quantum mechanics. A bond is broken or created, or the electrons move around in a particular way. And biological systems have an astonishing degree of control over that, giving the warm, wet, noisy environment of the cell. So that's really the bread and butter of quantum biology, if I may say so.
okay. Maybe we can talk a little bit about these pillars. What to you are the core pillars of the field that you think are the most um yeah, the most relevant right now?
Certainly. So, when I was studying quantum computing and I spoke to my PhD supervisor, I said, I really want to study these biological effects. Like any physicist, we say, okay, where do we begin? Given that this field is still emerging. Well, what is the atom of quantum biology? What is the most basic element? And we decided to look at electron transfer reactions because they're incredibly simple. An electron starts here and it tunnels over here. We know it's a quantum effect because the electron is tunneling through a dielectric barrier. Proteins aren't conductors like metals. So to go anywhere, the electron either has to go through the solvent or it has to tunnel through the protein. And so, beginning with electron transfer reactions, well, that got me looking about at the electronic structure, and these fundamental approximations in quantum mechanics and in chemistry, like what's called the Born-Oppenheimer approximation, which tells you that nuclei are heavy and electrons are light. So nuclei behave more classically than electrons tend to, right? The lightest nuclei, a single proton, a hydrogen nucleus, behaves more quantum mechanically than heavier atoms do, right? So that was a good start. But of course, there's exceptions to every rule. If you go to very heavy atoms like these transition metals, now they have so many electrons that the quantum mechanics gets interesting again. And of course, biological cofactors, these things that carry out chemical reactions, often use transition metals like copper and iron to carry out these transformations. So, that began to frame it in terms of the electronic structure of these systems that are kind of grounded in the more classical or semi-classical structure of the nuclei. And from there, I studied spin chemistry, and I realized that a lot of these spin chemical reactions actually begin with an electron transfer event, right? And a lot of photochemical reactions that again involve quantum mechanics because a photon is being absorbed by a molecule and does something interesting. That these typically involve electron transfer events or what are more generally called non-adiabatic transitions, things where they involve a quantum jump. That's what the
Mhm.
non-adiabatic means. So, it really began to present a picture to me that actually there is a starting point, that there's a foundation we can build in the electron structure, electron transfer events, these non-adiabatic events, and then, subtle effects that begin to come into play due to both light atoms like hydrogen and heavier atoms like the transition metals, where interactions between the electrons and the nuclei sometimes are also quantum mechanical. Book and or in a course if you were to take a course on quantum biology.
Yeah, you were just frozen for a minute, but I think I got what you're saying. Like the main thing is really that electron transfer to you is like the core, so to say, the atom of quantum biology, as you describe, and
It,
that
it,
actually
it
is
is.
very insightful.
And
Yeah.
more general, what's called a non-adiabatic transition, where a quantum jump occurs, right?
Yeah.
And the quantum jump is a first order transition to higher order effects that eventually get to a full integration of the Schrodinger equation, fully coherent dynamics. So we start with, the simplest kind of picture, which is adiabatic, which means everything's sitting still, really. You have the nuclei sitting still, and we have an electron cloud that is quantum mechanical, but it's not hard to model classically because it's just a cloud of electrons, right? And then we introduce quantum jumps at a first order effect, and then we introduce more complex, even interactions that are, as I said, quantum mechanical interactions, even between the nuclei and the electrons. But everything starts with the electronic structure and elementary changes to it, which involve the movement of an electron transfer event. So I think I've really painted that most, simple cartoon picture of it that at least gives you some intuition.
Well, thank you. That is actually very good intuition for me to understand better what like how to think about the field. And it makes sense because when I was looking at it previously, I would just see all these different areas and I would kind of see them sort of as random. Like when you just look at like let's say you ask Claude to map the field of quantum biology, it will tell you there's magnetoreception, there is photosynthesis, there is enzyme tunneling, there is maybe like I cannot. There will be two more but I forgot about them.
Right,
Maybe there's probably the microtubules in consciousness, and there's another one. These are the famous pillars that kind of made it through into the popular mind, let's say.
right,
And and now I can see how they are all connected in this. Like if I look at it, it's the electron that is the most important part in this when you think about the uh, photons and electrons being intimately related. And then photosynthesis makes sense. And then in the magnetoreception is about the spin of the electron. So it all makes sense now how they're all connected. So thank you for this beautiful explanation.
exactly. And so then, like you mentioned, photosynthesis, the electron gets excited by a photon. But remember, the most important step after that excitation occurs is the charge separation event, right?
Mhm.
sends the electron down the electron transport chain to run, ATP production, right? Well, that charge separation event is an electron transfer event, right? Even even that initial photon being absorbed, right, is an electron transfer event, except the electron's going not from point A to point B, it's going from a lower energy state to a higher energy state. So again, you see how everything is framed in this way to start with, at least.
Yeah, that's very nice. That makes it more systematic to look at the math now. Thank
Well,
you.
as a physicist, this is the goal. How can we make this systematic?
Yeah, thank you so much. That's a very good insight here. I'm also wondering, since the field is, let's say, I think it's fair to say it's rather small compared to the scale of all of physics and all the other things that are being funded and investigated right now. So I would love to see, from your perspective, let's say quantum biology takes off. You write the textbook and it becomes a field and becomes established and people understand it from the first principles, like you explain it, and they want to investigate it deeper. Then what could this field be when it gets the attention that they might deserve? Where could it end up being?
Oh, yeah, where is it going? Um, sure. Yeah, with enough attention. I mean, I think the sky's the limit, really, because we're looking at the building blocks of life itself. So you
Mm-hmm.
can just think about what we could do with that, right? Even the most fringe ideas people are talking about are actually still, what are the applications, right? Of
Hmm.
some of these fringe ideas compared to applications in biomedicine and biotechnology, for example,
Hmm.
right? You know, who would have thought when James Clerk Maxwell wrote down Maxwell's equations of electrodynamics that we'd all hold a little computer camera in our back pocket, right? So, I mean, to give you an example from my own experience, I was invited to give a keynote talk at a conference that was hosted by a major biomedical biotechnology company in Maryland earlier this year. And there was a lot of interest, obviously, in potential applications. So if you were working at a big biotech company and you're designing synthetic organs for organs implants, designer lungs, for example, and these things today get grown in a lab and they get helicoptered out to a hospital where someone needs a lung implant with synthetic lungs. So you want to create better organs, hearts, lungs, kidneys, right? You want them to live longer in the laboratory. You want them to grow faster and more efficiently, right? Now we have all these effects that we study, like photobiomodulation, where we can use frequencies of light to control healing and regeneration and potentially other forms of electromagnetic fields, static magnetic fields. So we can create a whole lifelike environment where we have a great deal of control of the living system, um, similar to the kind of control that biology has in it for itself. And that's one example for, something like an organ implant or regenerative medicine. But you
Hmm.
can think of diagnostic tools. You could think of biomaterials. We already have things like organic LEDs in our screens. The list of things that living things can do that we could now engineer becomes endless.
Okay. Nice. Thank you so much. At one point I will go a little bit deeper, I think, on the biophoton modulation. I think that's a very
Mhm.
interesting area. But before we go there, I think from the perspective of the DAO, we are basically like looking to accelerate quantum biology, like make this future that we just talked about, so to say, arrive as fast as we can make it arrive. And from our perspective, what we need to know is kind of where to direct attention and where to direct resources. And from your perspective, I'm wondering what do you think? Let's say, imagine a fund and you have basically no constraints. So where would you think the marginal dollar would do the most good right now in the field of quantum biology? And is that already where the attention is, or is that somewhere where you think it should be where, but it's not there?
I mean, given what I've described so far, my take on it, my personal perspective is, well, first let me say I love what you're doing. with the DAO.
Okay.
I've known Clarice for several years, and she's done great things for quantum biology. She seems some days to be everywhere all at once, doing research, promoting the field, encouraging dialogue with her big quantum biology meetings. And I have a ton of respect uh, for your work there with Clarice. And so, what would I say? Uh, my view is that there's still a great need for education concerning the nature and scope of quantum biology. So if I had a big bucket of money for research, I would want to spend it on scholarships, stipends, and research kind of associate positions for grad students and postdocs in quantum physics, quantum chemistry, molecular biology,
Mhm,
that's really necessary to build the foundation for the field in terms of personnel, right?
mhm,
Um, and now is that where the field's attention is right now? I mean, I wouldn't say it's being framed that way. It's been framed, for many years now as this debate between trivial and non-trivial. Well,
mhm,
that's not the right framing to produce skilled trainees, right?
mhm,
To clarify misconceptions and develop the groundwork for these kind of biotechnologies. So I think the biggest thing right now would be more funding for formal graduate education in quantum biology. That is where I would spend.
mhm. So really talent is like bringing in more talent into the field and building the
That's right. Yep, get biologists interested in learning quantum mechanics and
Mhm,
and get quantum physicists interested in learning the subtleties of biology that are
mhm,
not apparent when you just think of it as this warm, wet, noisy thing. Well, biology is a lot more complicated than that, and the quantum mechanics are a lot more subtle. So, absolutely, education to me is key.
nice. You just mentioned in this answer that this trivial, non-trivial debate you think is sort
Mhm.
of the wrong frame. Maybe it's the wrong frame for bringing in more talent, but I want to hear your take on it. Maybe can you summarize really quick what is the debate is because indeed it's a classical thing that you will encounter, and then give us your take on it.
Right, right. So this debate, I mean, I think it started at a conference where they had a panel discussion, and they said, "Are quantum effects trivial or not?" And they had kind of the true believers in quantum biology on one side and the hard-nosed skeptical physicists on the other. So it was it was for fun, right? And it was very interesting. But it's surprising to see how much that framing has persisted over the years. Are quantum effects trivial or not? What do we even mean by trivial, right? Even having a definition that everyone can agree on. One senior physicist, I think it was Wiseman, said that he wouldn't consider effect non-trivial unless it required advanced knowledge of quantum mechanics. Well, that's a pretty high bar. You know what I'm saying? So that's something that I've tried to clarify. People say it's trivial if it just tells you the molecular structure, right? Well, if the structure controls the function, and if it controls it in a non-trivial way, well, that's not trivial anymore, right? And so I feel like this non-trivial debate has almost been kind of like a shell game that you use the word to say, oh, well, it's all just trivial, but it implies almost a kind of idle skepticism, right?
Mhm,
And and actually in physics, trivial has a fairly formal definition that the trivial case is the case where things go to zero, right? So the trivial case of motion in a car is when the car is stopped and there's no motion, right? The trivial case of a quantum effect is when the quantum effects are negligible, right? When a semi-classical or classical model will be good enough, right? But even that case, often your classical model needs parameters. You treat a molecular bond as a spring, as a classical spring that can be stretched or compressed, right? But where do you get your spring constant? How do you know how stiff your spring is? Well, that
mhm,
comes from the underlying quantum mechanics. So I have to admit that people. who are calling quantum effects in biology trivial, they often sound to me like someone who says that in this house we have no need for bread because we only eat toast. Well, you kind of forgotten something there. So the real question is, how deeply do we need to look into these things to find where the non-trivial effects occur, right? Because actually, even a simple bond stretching effect can require very advanced quantum mechanical calculations, even for something simple like a hydrogen molecule. So, so I think triviality has been in the eye of the beholder so far, but my goal is to put it on firm grounds in terms of ordered sets of approximations, from the simplest approximations to more and more complex, we say in physics, first order, second order, third order approximations. And now this actually gives substance to the question of how complex the quantum effect we're looking at is. And then we get into things like quantum complexity theory that computer scientists talk about. So I digress, but I hope this gives you an impression of how we can build from that debate that was somewhat subjective to really objective understanding of complexity in quantum biology.
Yeah, I find it very interesting how you deal with this question. Like maybe to push back just a little bit, while I
Please.
also see your position. Like when I first encountered the field, right? I'm a philosopher, so I wasn't trained as a physicist and I wasn't trained as a quantum biologist. But as a philosopher, you get to encounter physics at one point and you have to deal with it. So I knew some of it, but then I wanted to see, okay, is quantum biology, what is quantum biology, right? So I started reading Schrödinger's What is Life.
Hmm.
And in that book, in some sense, you encounter what let's say classically or not traditionally, I shouldn't say classical because that will be confusing, but what traditionally is called a trivial quantum effect because Schrödinger kind of writes a hypothesis out for like what the DNA could be, that DNA could be an aperiodic crystal, and in some sense, like you said, the triviality comes down to just the structure of the molecule, and there's no let's say quantum effects used for function in the sense that beyond the molecule there's like a superposition or something like this that somehow does biological functions, at least not in this book yet. And I was thinking, maybe actually for a moment I was like, okay, maybe actually quantum biology has already happened. And it is now basically called structural biology or molecular biology. And I was like, okay, fine. So what are these guys still doing? You know, what are you actually looking for? And maybe that is like to some degree, I think it's a valid concern. Like, what else are we looking for? Can you
Sure.
maybe answer that from your side? Or I want to also say grant you the fact that I like like one workaround that you have said is, well, but you still have to do that kind of quantum biology that gives you the structure of the actual thing. So you to parameterize the whole model and to even have a model of the DNA or have a model of all the other things that are in the body, you still need the quantum physics. But I want you to answer to this skeptical, like, has quantum biology already happened kind of moment that I had in my, yeah. What else are you looking for?
So this is, I think you framed it perfectly for me to elaborate on what I've already said, because certainly if we're only looking at structural effects, then this argument that the quantum mechanics of the structure can be swept under the rug is very strong. Um, you know, I might need quantum mechanics to understand the crystal structure of a diamond. But I don't need quantum mechanics to know that diamond is one of the hardest substances on Earth. It also has obviously very beautiful optical properties and so on and so forth. And we could study all of these things at a classical level. Once we have our parameters, we have our index of refraction, and we have our various engineering constants that we could use to study, the shear and the strain things in any material, right? Um, and that's absolutely fair for materials which are only structural. But of course, biology is not only structural, right? Uh, what if we had a diamond, where under certain conditions, certain un environmental transition conditions, that its properties would cease to be like the properties of diamond and turn something like more into the properties of wood or, some biological molecule. Well, in fact, there's still a debate open about whether microtubules have refractive properties, optical properties, more like diamond or more like other proteins. And, regardless of what the outcome of that debate is, that that biological systems are very functional. They have a lot of control over what they do and what their properties are at a given moment. And so I'm not deeply invested in the quantum biology of hair, for example, right? I'm invested in the quantum biology of the cofactors at the center of enzymes where chemical processes, chemical transformations occur, right? A hair is just a material. It's wound up kind of like a rope. It has this nice braid to it. But you're right, it's basically trivial once you know that it has a certain tensile strength, right? But these cofactors that are arranged in, exquisite ways in order to control different chemical transformations. Now, in order to understand what they do, we can't sweep the quantum mechanics under the rug anymore. And in fact, even, very well-known cofactors like these flavins, riboflavin, vitamin B, right? You see them in all kinds of enzymes, and we know they carry out oxidation reactions, reactions with oxygen. We know they're photoactive. We believe that they have radical pair reactions to sense magnetic fields. And although the properties of these molecules are fairly well understood on their own, once you put them in the protein environment with the solvent and everything else going around, now the protein has control over the different optical, chemical, and so forth properties of the cofactor in ways that we don't understand at all. There's still open debates about what level of quantum mechanical approximations we even need to properly study a cofactor like flavin in a protein. And
Mhm.
and so actually there's very deep quantum mechanics, buried there in the quantum chemistry and in quantum modeling theory that need to be teased out before we're going to be able to make enzymes that function anywhere near with the kind of precision control like biology has been doing for, eons, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm kind of getting the picture. So it's like beyond the structure of the molecule, there's also a lot of things that happen when it's, so to say, in action. And in this, when it's in action, that it seems like we cannot get around quantum biology, and it seems not trivial at all, but instead it seems very kind of necessary to even understand what is happening at the level of action.
This is it. If we were wind-up toys, then I would agree that the quantum mechanics is trivial, right? And you can describe the actual mechanics of a wind-up car or a wind-up little tin soldier, purely classically. You don't need to know the materials properties, right? But they don't
Mhm.
have metabolism. It seems to emerge from an overly mechanistic picture of biology, of biological systems as machines, even though biological systems, although they're machine-like in some ways, are totally different from the kind of machines that we see that humans have created.
Okay. Well, thank you. This definitely clears it up, and it also makes it clear why you want to kind of put the focus more on like opening quantum biology educational positions to get these people out of the other frames where they only have to deal with the structures without worrying about the quantum biology to actually also look at the actions and like build that expertise which doesn't exist apparently outside of this field where they really focus on the structure only and only look at these effects.
Right, and that's been to some extent an artifact of limits of structural methods, right? But as we get high and higher resolution X-ray crystallography, and now time resolved X-ray crystallography, we're actually being able to probe the quantum scale, looking at molecular crystals on a subatomic scale. So some of it is, simply happening as the resolution of our experimental techniques improves.
Okay. Um, I think what is like back to this vision a little bit more because we you painted a great vision of what the field could be. You talked a little bit about some of the of the applications. You said, for example, in organs, but like that's still kind of a rare thing that maybe an organ transplant. I have never encountered anybody get an transplant so far. But let's say quantum biology is successful and it becomes a big field. Then what would like let's say it delivers on all its promises, then what are the things that an ordinary person might actually encounter because of quantum biology, because it has been a hit? Like a medical thing, a device, something, a treatment that most people would just encounter and maybe not even know that it is quantum physics underneath.
Right. I mean, we already see quantum effects in biology at an MRI machine, right, in the
Mhm,
hospital. So we can clearly expect to see more developments in the area of diagnostic imaging.
mhm, mhm,
Beyond that, I think we're going to see more and more treatments, not just diagnostics, but treatments with quantum mechanical underpinnings. I mentioned light therapy,
mhm,
whereby specific frequencies of light are used to treat specific diseases. It's over a
mhm,
century old. But it's
mhm,
begun to see a bit of a renaissance lately
mhm,
with this thing of photobiomodulation therapy, using red
mhm,
light to heal wounds, right?
mhm,
Actually, even using electromagnetic fields to improve bone healing has been around
mhm,
since the 80s. It's been
mhm.
approved by the FDA
Can
since then.
can you maybe say a little bit more about this, especially like what is happening there? Like that sounds super interesting. So you can use red light to heal wounds. How's that work? But is Nathan frozen for you too, Kira? Yeah. Oh, now you're back. You were frozen for a second, but I was asking.
Yeah, I lost you
Um,
for a second there.
Just like I want to, like I said earlier already, I want to know more about this special about this field. And now is the perfect moment to ask you where you just mentioned it. It's like you said you can use red light or maybe other forms of light to, in this case, you were saying red light to heal wounds. Maybe explain a little bit what is known about this and how that works.
Right. So it's definitely not fully understood. The idea is that certain frequencies of light interact with the electron transport chain. This is a set of biological molecules, cofactors in
Mhm,
a membrane, for
mhm,
example, where now the red light helps to stimulate the electron flow. We think
mhm,
we don't really understand it as well as we'd like to. That's why more research is necessary. But the idea is if you enhance respiration, by enhancing electron flow through the respiratory chain, the electron transport chain,
mhm,
now the cells can grow and heal a little faster. This
mhm,
is a very preliminary picture of how this works. But they've done research now where they add gold nanoparticles to the wound and they apply the photobiomodulation therapy, and the wound heals even faster. Hair grows faster, right?
mhm,
Originally, this photobiomodulation, or sometimes it's called low-level light therapy, low-level
mhm,
laser therapy, it was discovered by an experimentalist who was trying to figure out if he could use red light to treat cancer. Um,
mhm,
but the laser he was using wasn't strong enough to like zap the cancer to kill it. And instead, he saw that it encouraged cell growth instead. And said, wow, what is going on here? So, things like NASA were interested in this. If they could put a device on the space shuttle, because of course in space, you don't want astronauts having to worry about a paper cut or something like that. They want wounds to heal up very quickly for astronauts in space. Um, but it opens a whole, realm of, how close can we be to having the Star Trek tricorder or the Star Trek, a zapper that where they just shine the light on your wound and it heals right up.
TV was before my generation, so I never watched Star Trek.
That's
I
all
know it,
right.
of course, but what is that device that you're describing?
Yeah, they just yeah, well, I don't even know what they call it. Someone comes in and they've been hit by a phaser, they've got a wound in their shoulder and they
Mhm,
don't stitch it up. They have a little device that, shines some ray on it and now it just heals right up on its own.
mhm,
Well, I mean, that might seem far-fetched, but we actually know in principle that that kind of effect is real. And we
Hmm.
don't understand it well enough to know how far we could take it, right?
Hmm.
So it's very exciting, to explore that kind of area because we really don't know the limits of these kind of things.
Hmm.
And there are some things that are on the market already. I was at the meeting of the American Society for Photobiology last month, and I was amazed by the number of talks on photodynamic therapy,
Hmm.
which I talk about in chapter 16 of the monograph.
Hmm.
And, it's a treatment where now you put nanoparticles or, little, molecular, um, well, it's a chemotherapeutic agent that the
Hmm.
person ingests and it goes through their body systemically. And now if you shine light where the tumor is, that activates the particle and it begins to kill the cancer.
Hmm.
And this photodynamic therapy is a very effective adjunct therapy for certain cancer treatments. And so you might get radiation therapy or chemotherapy, and then they can use photodynamic therapy as the kind of the final step to clean up the last little bit, so to decrease the likelihood that the cancer comes back. And for
Hmm.
some types of cancer, this can be, a big improvement on therapeutic outcomes, but it's still not widely used or recognized by doctors, or at least not as much as it could be. And so again, some of it is just educating doctors, even, right? So that they're aware of this treatment, that it's not magic or something like that, that it has a sound physical basis that scientists are researching and that they can help save lives,
Hmm.
simply by adding it to an existing cancer treatment program. These are just a few examples.
I think this is why I wanted to double click on this concept because I thought it's really interesting to see how you can use light to like heal. And apparently there is more to it than meets the eye because it does seem like science fiction, right? It does seem like um, maybe it is true, but I wouldn't believe it today. Maybe, like maybe the average person wouldn't believe it today that you can do it. And so I think this brings up a different, an interesting point that you also make in the monograph. Like I think Brandy makes it in the monograph where
Ah,
she
yeah.
basically frames the and says, okay, look, there is a concern here with quantum biology and especially using it to heal in medicine because there is people out there who use terms like quantum healing and kind of misuse the word quantum where the actual line between the legitimate frontier of what is possible and in maybe biophotomodulation or in other areas of quantum biology
Mhm.
where they mix with pseudoscience and where pseudoscientific practitioners use these terms and borrow the quantum vocabulary. So how can we like make better uh, like demarcation here? Like how can we police the field?
You're right. And I like to think most of the times there's a clear distinction between actual quantum research and using the term quantum metaphorically as a promotional gimmick.
Mhm.
We might call something a quantum leap if it's
Mhm.
a major advancement, even if it has nothing to do with quantum theory. We got a bill in the mail the other day from a place called Quantum Imaging. Well,
Mhm.
they don't do actually what I would call quantum imaging. They do MRIs and ultrasounds. The name of the business is quantum imaging. Most of the
Mhm.
time, you know the difference, right?
Mhm.
It only becomes a problem if it's unclear if the term is being used scientifically or metaphorically, and this is where pseudoscience comes in, right? If I say I'm doing quantum healing, is it just the name of my business is quantum healing, right?
Mhm.
Or am I actually trying to say something substantial about
Mhm.
the treatment that I provide,
Yeah.
right? And sometimes this is not clear even to the practitioners.
Mhm.
Um, but the thing is, a lot of hard science today began as fringe science 200 years ago.
Mhm.
Before Maxwell wrote down his equations for electrodynamics, the so-called electricians of the 19th century, they were doing parlor tricks with copper wires, trying to catch lightning in a bottle, things like that, right? Well, no one does anything like that today because we all have electricity and cell phones, right? No one's thinking outside trying to catch lightning in a bottle because the science and technology has advanced so much.
Mhm.
since then. Um, and so, for example, we talked about photobiomodulation and the research. But of course, I know that there are hundreds, maybe even thousands of products advertising red light therapy as cure for various ailments. The latest ones are these red light masks you put on their face. They're supposed to
Mhm.
help eliminate wrinkles.
Mhm.
So the first thing you need to ask yourself as a consumer is this thing FDA approved or what, right? You talk about like infrared light therapy. I love the infrared sauna, right?
Mhm.
I think it's the best. But I'm not claiming it's a medical device per se. This
Mhm.
is the thing. And so, actual medical devices that are being developed using photobiomodulation, for example, tend to be specialized treatment devices for wound healing that are still at the experimental phase. And
Mhm.
so when it comes down to it, I'm not aware that there are any like proven quantum medical devices with claims that are really thoroughly backed up yet today, because the science isn't there yet. Now,
Mhm.
I don't know. I haven't tested the wrinkle removing red light mask, right? Um, and so I think that really the best cure for this is to advance the science, so
Mhm.
that we advance to the point where we know what's reasonable and what's not.
Mhm.
And ultimately, policing the boundary is a moot point in as much as, some of these quantum claims are just marketing gimmicks. There's always going to be marketing gimmicks. And
Mhm.
ultimately, the scientific research is going to prove them or disprove them in time. And the adoption of new therapies, real, scientifically motivated therapies, will be so much different in the future
Mhm.
that it will no longer be a question of what is really a
Mhm.
true quantum therapy and what is just quantum in name only.
Mhm. So there's a lot of work to do actually. Like these things that we have just like we were envisioning the future of like Star Trek, but actually to get there right now we have to really dig down and really do the research kind of.
That's just it. And the same way that we have had, centuries of work in the past to go from steam engines to internal combustion engines to now, lithium battery cars, right? And hydrogen fuel cells and things like that. We have a lot of the same work to develop in biotech and quantum biology over the coming decades.
Mhm. So I think what is interesting in this domain, like when we're talking about like going from steam engines to like electrical engines and so on and so forth, like quantum computing already has that let's say that fuse lit and it's going to explode one day. It has already so much energy in it. Like maybe it's impossible, and then all the money will be burned. But they seem to be making steady progress. And
No, they're certainly
quantum,
doing something, right? What it will
yeah,
lead to, we will see.
they're at least doing something. They're always at least they see a lot of press releases, let's say, and they seem to be getting more and more serious.
Yeah.
And in quantum biology, I feel like it doesn't yet have the same attention. It doesn't yet have the same energy. So much of the interesting work in quantum biology kind of sits outside of what mainstream is willing to fund right now or even take serious. And I think what can we do to like establish this? How can we go from maybe something that's ahead of its time, like to distinguish what is ahead of its time from what is bad science and make it really clear that it's really ahead of its time and people should invest in it rather than have this skepticism. Like maybe this wasn't perfectly formulated, but let me say sum up what I mean. It's like how do we get to the point where quantum computing, where we get the same trust of quantum computing with the same, like there's still a little doubt about it, but
Yeah.
that where they believe it could actually work and they are going to fund it, even the mainstream. What needs to happen for that to happen?
Yeah, and that's a very interesting question. I I would say quantum biology is something of a niche area. I hate to say it's not mainstream because prominent research studying quantum effects in biology gets published in journals like Science, Nature, the American Chemical Society, journals of the American Physical Society. So
Mhm.
what is it about it that it's going to need to happen, uh, you know, to get that like hype like quantum computing have? That's an interesting question. When we went looking for a publisher for Physical Principles of Quantum Biology, one publisher said they thought it was too far ahead of its time, right? World Scientific picked it up immediately. I
Yeah.
had an editor from World Scientific looking at it the next day after it came out on the archive in 2025. Um, so this question about bad science. I mean, maybe I can answer your question by answering that. So bad science isn't ever ahead of its time. It's just bad, right? The difference is a lot of bad science is baseless speculation, right?
Mhm.
Um, a fair amount of criticism of quantum biology, I fear, has come from a place of idle speculation. You know, it's not good science just to say, well, I don't believe it because I don't want to believe it, but I haven't really looked, you know.
Mhm.
And I've seen at least one paper where the skeptics in the debate said, well, we don't really know anything about quantum effects in biology, but we're skeptical anyways. Well, I'm sorry, that's not being a scientist either. That's just being a naysayer, right? So
Well, if I don't know, it can't be true, you know?
right, if I
Like,
don't know, it can't be true. Like I say no more. Say no more. So, you know, science that's truly ahead of time, it sees things that others don't see yet, right? Bad science sees things that others don't see, and others don't see them because they're not there, right?
yeah,
What's the difference between seeing the future and seeing a mirage? Well, I think in a lot of cases in science, it's really doing your homework, right?
yeah.
I counted up the other day. I think I took 8 different courses in quantum mechanics over the course of
Mhm.
my education, right? Like, like you really need to understand the quantum mechanics inside and out. You need to understand, advanced areas of quantum mechanics, even to know whether the models you're using are actually going to capture the quantum phenomena, or you're using an oversimplified model that says the quantum mechanics are trivial because the quantum mechanics of the model you used are trivial, right? So you're looking at this, quantum classical boundary where you actually have to look very deeply into the quantum mechanics in order to begin to know what you expect to see in the future and what not.
Yeah. So the insight needs to be it needs to be based on like the logical insights, like actually conceptually understanding the effects, and then you can, so to say, project. And you're like that because you
Right.
understand the actual quantum physics, you can be like, yeah, this is in principle possible, and now it becomes an engineering problem.
This is
And
it.
that's sort of what you need. It reminds me of like as a philosopher, there's this one philosopher called Leibniz. He's famous
Yeah.
because he had this debate with Newton who invented calculus first, right? And Leibniz also invented binary. And then when he invented binary, he said, "Look, I can break down all logical concepts to like encode them with binary code, and then I can have a reasoning machine that just reasons by itself." And then he built that a prototype of that machine, and that is today is the computer.
Right.
But back then he knew he could build it, right? But he couldn't build it in his time. It was like to 1700. So around 1700, the material science wasn't there to make semiconductors to make this actually practical. And
Right.
I think that sort of is maybe similar here, where quantum biology, you can maybe see it if you have the knowledge of the effect, but you might not actually know that you need semiconductors. It's
No, who would
not
have guessed that?
like, I mean, we probably need something else, but yeah, that is not basically implied already in that's a whole different problem, so to say, in the how do I build a device to abuse the effect.
Right. Yeah. No, that's just it. That if you wanted to truly see into the future, if you want to see deeply into the future, you need to have deep knowledge of the material now, right?
Yeah,
And as if it's something you're passionate about. Does it keep you up at night every night? That
yeah.
right? There's a story about oh gosh, who was it? The uh Pauli exclusion principle. I think it was Wolfgang Pauli. He was pacing around like the town square one day, something like that. His friend came up to him. He said, Pauli, you look very distressed. He said, are you unhappy? And, And Pauli said, trying to think of it. Who who can be happy when they're thinking about this? I forget the name of it now, but it was a particular anomaly in quantum
Hmm.
mechanics at the time, and he
Hmm.
couldn't stop thinking about this specific anomaly, and it ended up being the splitting between the spin states of the system
Yeah,
that he finally discovered.
yeah.
But he couldn't live with himself until this anomaly. And he shouted to his friend, who could be happy when they're thinking
Yeah,
about
like
this
how are you so
anomaly,
happy? Like,
right?
why are you not worried? Like,
How can you be happy? Right? Like,
what's wrong with you? Like,
yeah, no,
this
so,
major problem is being solved. Like, it's a major crisis, and you seem so
yeah.
happy. Yeah. No, I understand that. So basically, you're constantly unhappy because we don't build the right machines to use the.
I just like I said, I became fascinated with quantum biology. I just think
Yeah.
it's the most fascinating area of quantum physics. You asked me kind of, where I think all this is going, right? I talked about biotechnology, but to me as a physicist,
Hmm.
I want to know what new things in quantum physics
Hmm.
biology will teach us.
Hmm.
Usually we have a quantum system we study, we cool it down, we isolate it so we can really get to the quantum mechanics. And then we have our classical detectors, right? Even if all the semiconductors in our detectors actually rely on quantum mechanics, technically the classical measuring apparatus. Well, the distinction is very clear. But in biology, often in these multi-scale modeling approaches, now the quantum part and the classical environment are like they're touching, they're right in proximity. And so now all of these thorny questions about, what is the quantum system, what is the measuring device, this quantum classical boundary and what's called the correspondence principle. That there should be some correspondence between the quantum world and the classical macroscopic world. All that gets kind of blurred,
Hmm.
actually. The real challenge is to tease out, what is needs to be described quantum mechanically and that we can now average over, as semi-classical in the biological milieu, its surroundings. So I think that it's going to teach us about even the deep philosophy of quantum mechanics, studying the quantum classical boundary in biology, where it's very easy to say, oh well, it's just warm, wet, and noisy. Well, no, actually, we don't understand the quantum classical boundary in the rest of quantum physics. It's certainly not in biology, where now it's actually very complicated.
Hmm. Okay. So you're looking for the theoretical insights. That's what keeps you. That's what's keep
Yeah,
you.
I would love to know what biology can teach us about quantum mechanics. I
Okay.
really, I talk about this, with Brandy towards the end of the book. We think that there's something to be discovered here. Um, well, I mean, please continue. I could go on about that for days.
Yeah, but that's great. That's great to see. So I think um, one thing that also is interesting in this field, like we have been talking about how we get it to get the same hype that maybe quantum computing has, but also the field seems to have less has some issues. I mean, quantum computing also has these issues. They constantly say, "Hey, we have supremacy achieved," and then a couple of weeks later, somebody posts a classical algorithm that can do the same because they now were motivated to find an algorithm that they previously weren't motivated to find because nobody cared about the problem. But
Well, that's it.
like, I mean, still they get funding, but I want to describe something in quantum biology where there was these findings, and I think in 2007 from I think Berkeley, where they found effects in photosynthesis, and they were claiming there were some efficiency gains in the photosynthetic process from quantum effects, but that was later kind of called into question,
Yeah.
and that of course kind of throws some shade onto the field. And it's like, okay, if you're a funder looking at this, you're like, okay, I don't know, do I want to invest in something that maybe 10 years later is called into question? So how do you as a funder kind of, let's say you were a funder, how would you look at this at the field and make sure that you invest in something that's actually solid? How do you tease out what is potentially will be worked back from what is actually solid?
Right. And so yes, uh, just to summarize, there was this, kind of high profile publication about long-lived coherence in photosynthesis, and they speculated that it might aid the photosynthetic efficiency. Then, if I know what you're referring to, is 10 years later in 2017, there was a high-profile paper by I think the two head authors were Mike Thorett and Dwayne Miller, uh, that said, well, we don't, really see quantum coherence here at all. And this, I think, is a great question, this topic, because it reflects the depth of the research and common misunderstandings about the research. Because now almost another decade has gone by, and if you read a paper in Science Advances from October last year, what they show is that that specific study from 2017, actually the negative that they got in their result and in similar work, the problem was not the lack of coherence. The problem was that the theoretical approximations that they used were not adequate to describe the pigment protein system in question. And so I can give you a link to that article in Science Advances that explains how those studies were flawed because they basically assumed their conclusion. They used an oversimplified model that wouldn't be able to see the fundamental quantum effects there.
I
I
actually saw
can,
a presentation on this when I went to this quantum biology conference, QUEPS 2026, Quantum Effects in Biology 2026, where they
yeah,
showed, I think the author of that paper that you mentioned from 2025, um, Nicola Lorenzoni, he was presenting. Is it that like the full microscopic simulations uncover
yeah,
persistent quantum effects in primary photosynthesis from 2025? Yeah,
that that's
he was presenting and showing that there are actually quantum effects, but not of the kind that were claimed in 2027.
this is
And
it.
so what we see here is, and that's actually interesting to see. It was worked back only to be worked back on the walk back. So we have the double negation where we're back at the beginning, but of course not in the same way because when you come back to the beginning after you have negated it first, it's not the same. It's like
Right.
yeah. But interestingly, I think that kind of covers it does relate to what I was asking myself in like quantum computing. It's like apparently if you're investigating at the frontier, you have to expect that this happens and
Well, of course.
continue to invest.
No, and that's why I'm so glad you raised this issue because in fact, to anyone who thinks this effect is trivial, well, if some of these, top guys in spectroscopy and quantum mechanics have now been debating this for about 2 decades, I guess it's not that trivial after all. It
Mhm,
really demonstrates the subtlety of research in quantum biology that you really need advanced expertise in quantum mechanics just to interpret at face value what appeared to be a straightforward result in
mhm,
2007. And so if Howard Wiseman's listening to this, who said he would only consider a quantum effect in biology non-trivial if it required advanced level knowledge of quantum mechanics to understand, I think we've met the bar now after 2 decades of intense scrutiny and the jury's still out, right?
mhm,
And so this really shows how quantum biology actually is an advanced scientific field on par with other areas of research at the
mhm,
frontiers, not just of biology and chemistry, but at the frontier of quantum mechanics itself, because we have to learn, how to simulate quantum mechanical systems from first principles. And that alone is anything but trivial.
mhm. That seems to be the hard part here. It's like, how do I model the system? And because in general, in quantum biology or in quantum science in general, it's like you immediately run into these problems because the scaling, the more particles are involved, the harder it is to even calculate the calculation. And there's all these approximations, and it's apparently it looks hard to choose the right ones to know if you still get the effect or not.
That's it, even in the case where you can find a reasonable semi-classical approximation for for your system, simply deriving the correct approximation from the underlying quantum mechanics can require very advanced knowledge of quantum mechanics just to make sure you got your classical approximation right, right?
Mhm.
Someone has to do that work. That doesn't come for free.
Yeah, that's not comfortable. Yeah, okay. I'm glad that we talked about this, and I see it's still a challenge because indeed, like it's hard. Like if you talk to anybody investing their money into something, they are basically giving. They have to give into something. Still out like it is in some nature it is speculative in some sense because it keeps on swinging between negated and not negated, and
Right.
so it's like a sense where like in quantum I guess this in the end it comes down to vibes. You know, like there's a new term that they have in AI
Well,
investing.
no, but it was, I mean, I wrote the chapter on photosynthesis. We put it on the archive in March of 2025, and that
Yeah.
Science Advances paper came out in October, right? To me, the writing was on the wall. You read the paper that claims to negate it, but you read it very carefully. You read it between the lines a little bit,
Mhm.
and you can see what they say and what they're careful not to say, right?
Mhm.
You know, and again, this paper from 2025, you see what they say and what they're careful not to say. And it's already painting a picture that no, the simple quantum coherent effect isn't quite what they expected, but there's almost certainly a vibronic coupling effect, which is quantum mechanical in itself. And if there's something interesting quantum mechanically going on here, and it very much appears that there is, it's actually subtlety between the electronic system and the nuclear system, the phononic system, right? And so we don't have to have that kind of schoolyard debate. No, it's not. Yes, it is. Trivial, non-trivial, right? If we actually have some subtlety and nuance, and we're not so keen to pick black or white, but we understand that the nuance is all in the gray area and that there's a
Mhm.
lot of contour and
Yeah.
shade in that area, and that the system is complex. The system is not whatever it's doing, it's not trying to
Mhm.
satisfy our preconceived notions on one
Mhm.
side or the other side of some artificial spectrum.
So actually now I'm getting a little bit of a better picture. It's more that you think the funder should take the frame is like, oh, there's a lot of gray area, so I should actually investigate this. I should basically fund it because I need to see more clearly in this blurry field.
Well, that's just it. You need to know, what are the interesting questions in molecular biology, right? Where has quantum mechanics answered those questions? Where have classical models been adequate? Where do the classical models break down? And where do we still need, even in the case of a classical model, to do the underlying quantum mechanical simulations to create the parameters for a classical model? So all of this, really comes down to, understanding what are the critical quantum effects to understand the function of these systems and understanding what level of approximation is needed to understand the function of these systems. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. So in some sense that you made it even very even broader. It's like the modeling in itself, you really need to understand the right way to model these systems, and that's what you should that's the way that you should look at it. And you shouldn't be scared that sometimes something will work back. It's like, no, you're calibrating the modeling, and if you look at it from that angle, then it's really worth it because in the end you'll have a well calibrated calculus or like model that you can use again and again.
Precisely. And in turn, with that Science Advances paper from last year, now that they've done the most advanced modeling they could think of, now they have a list of new experiments that they can
Mhm.
propose
Mhm.
to tease out even more
Mhm.
information from the 2D spectroscopy
Mhm.
than they had that will now further allow them to refine their models. So there's always like a leapfrog kind of between
Mhm.
theory and experiment.
Well, we're kind of coming towards the end of this conversation, and I first want to say thank you so much because you really up-leveled my knowledge of quantum biology in this conversation, giving me a better understanding of the way to think of it from first principles, and even just now what you said about the way to look at it from a funder's perspective, that makes so much sense. Like the way that it's like, okay, actually calibrate the modeling. That makes sense. That's a nice call to action in some sense.
Mhm.
And I'm really happy that we had you here on this in this interview. I hope this won't have been the last time. and we get to have you return another time. Um, but before we end it, I kind of want to ask you some more, like, let's say, lighthearted questions.
Oh, sure.
And so the first one is, what are you most excited for in the field?
I right. I mean, I mentioned biotechnology. I think those are very exciting, for society as a whole. Personally, as a quantum physicist, it's really this question of how to model these systems. Where is the quantum classical boundary, and what can our understanding of the quantum classical boundary, insofar as there is one in quantum biology, uh, what can that teach us about quantum mechanics itself? Can we answer these age-old questions about the measurement problem of quantum mechanics or the correspondence principle of quantum mechanics, um, or at least shed more light on them by looking into the subtleties of quantum effects in biology? That's what really I find most intriguing, and obviously it reflects my view as a quantum physicist.
Nice. Yeah, so it's interesting that like in the beginning I framed you to have moved completely into biology, but actually you remain firmly seated on the side of the physicist.
I'm
And you
afraid so.
so
Yeah, but I
yeah,
had to learn a ton of, quantum chemistry, biochemistry, chemical kinetics, right? Some of these, laboratory methods that I wouldn't know how to do, and structural biology as well. I did a postdoc in structural biology where we studied how inadequate these simple classical models of the X-ray structures of the crystal structures were when you went to high resolution X-ray crystal data, right? And that's exciting to me too, is understanding the underlying electronic structure of these molecules, which we're actually only now becoming able to interrogate for the first time with some of these call them sub-angstrom X-ray diffraction experiments.
great. I saw Kira, you raised this in the chat that if anybody else from the audience has questions, you're also free to ask them. I'm going to just say that out loud in case you didn't read the chat. And meanwhile, I have another question. So you you basically are in the process of writing the first textbook that could maybe unify the field and build the next generation of talent, like you also advocated for in the beginning, like
It's the
earlier.
dream.
And I think maybe you are a good person to ask this question. It's like, okay, indeed, as a newcomer, it's kind of hard to get into the field because there is no cohesion. There's like, what is the field? And there's sort of a debate. And what I'm wondering, what is your advice to a newcomer, maybe a young student, or even, let's say, an established physicist who wants to broaden the horizon and who, like you, believes there is quantum effects in biology? Like, what can the
Right.
newcomers do? How do they get into it?
Right. I mean, to the newcomers, of course, as a physicist, I say start from first principles, build your research up from there, learn as much quantum mechanics as you possibly can. I've approached quantum biology from the essential physics of the electron structure and electron transfer theory and built up from there. But from that essential basis, there's a lot of different ways you can go. So, so my advice is to start with the fundamental quantum physics, and then ask yourself what intrigues me the most, right? And see where that essential question takes you in biology, right? Because if you're looking at biology from a quantum physics perspective, there must have been something that grabbed your attention there, right? So follow that and get the basics and build it up from your own set of foundations. And that's where you're going to really be able to do, I would say world-class work, but because you've put the whole picture together.
Nathan, I've loved hearing your interview. Thanks again for coming and talking to us today. So I basically am wondering, you said you're excited about biotech opportunities. What do you think the most promising near-term biotech application emerging from the field is, specifically in like medical?
Yeah. I mean, like some of these different cancer treatments, photodynamic therapy, chemodynamic therapy, really we need to better understanding of the fundamental chemistry to know how these treatments work, that helps motivate doctors to apply them and also to improve them. Some of them we don't understand the physics well enough in order to get kind of as much bang for the buck as we would expect to get out of this treatment. From that point, I really think I would say I also mentioned implants and regenerative medicine. Um, in in the book, when you get to part 3, you'll see a number of areas where there are places where, especially things like photobiomodulation, should be able to help heal tissues faster, grow them faster in the lab, um, as an adjunct to cancer treatment. So that, of course, if you have radiation therapy, you need to heal. And so do we have an adjunct treatment that will help your tissue heal faster, but not make the cancer grow back, right? And so I think understanding deep aspects of metabolism will help enormously in regenerative medicine, in medical biotechnology, implants for organ replacements and things like that. And, also for more forward-looking biotechnology, because, now we're really beginning to understand how life works at its core. And we can say, well, what can we enhance here? What other treatments can we develop to put you back together when you kind of begin to break apart in ways we hadn't thought of before? That's what's I think is most near on the horizon.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you. Great, great Star Trek reference, by the way. Big fan.
My pleasure.